By the mid-1930s, the name of Vsevolod Meyerhold, an outstanding director whose innovative ideas revolutionized the theater world, had long been shrouded in glory. His Meyerhold State Theatre, GOSTIM in Moscow, was not just a stage, but a veritable laboratory where bold forms were born, where actors moved like mechanisms, and where the scenery changed right before the audience's eyes. He was the living embodiment of Theatrical October, a bold experimenter who believed that art should be at the forefront of change. His productions, such as Gogol's The Inspector General and Mayakovsky's The Bedbug, became milestones in the history of world theater, demonstrating how classics can sound new, sharp, and contemporary. However, the winds of change in the country were shifting direction. Cultural policy began to tighten, and freedom of experimentation was replaced by socialist realism, the only acceptable method in art. It required artists to glorify Soviet reality and avoid formalism and decadence. For Meyerhold, whose work was the embodiment of form and the search for deeper meanings, this was a death sentence. His theater, which until recently had been the pride of the country, became a target for criticism. In 1938, GOSTIM was closed, and Meyerhold himself was left without work, without a stage, without the opportunity to create. Nevertheless, even in such a hopeless situation, the director did not break down. A few days before his arrest, in June 1939, at the first All-Union Conference of Directors, he gave a speech that became his last public appearance. In it, despite the threatening atmosphere, he openly opposed the imposed socialist realism, calling it pathetic and poor, and stating that what you call theater has nothing to do with art. This was an incredibly bold, even desperate statement, in a situation where any dissent was punished in the most brutal way. How could a man who had served art all his life remain silent when he saw his brainchild being disfigured? He must have understood that he was signing his own death warrant, but the artist's voice proved stronger than fear. The consequences were not long in coming. Shortly after this speech, on 20 June 1939, Vsevolod Meyerhold was arrested in Leningrad, where he had traveled on business. He was at the Finland station, preparing to leave for his dacha, when people in plain clothes approached him. Imagine, yesterday you were a luminary of world theater, and today you are an unknown prisoner whose name is already being erased from history. It was a moment when his familiar world collapsed, replaced by a world of interrogations, cells, and silent walls. He was taken to Moscow, to the infamous Lubyanka, the headquarters of the NKVD. For many citizens of the USSR, the very mention of this building evoked chilling horror. This was the beginning of a journey into an abyss from which few returned. Endless interrogations began, lasting for hours, sometimes even days. Investigators took turns demanding that he confess to counter-revolutionary activities, espionage, and participation in conspiracies. Meyerhold, a man whose life was devoted to the theater, found himself caught up in an absurd whirlwind of accusations that had nothing to do with reality. He denied everything, but the system, which worked to extract the necessary testimony, did not accept refusals. At the same time, just a few weeks after his arrest, another tragedy occurred that completely destroyed his world. On 15 July 1939, his wife, the famous actress Zinaida Reich, was brutally murdered. It happened in their Moscow apartment. Such a coincidence, with the arrest of her husband and the murder of his wife following one after the other, could not have been accidental. It was a blow intended to break him completely, to deprive him of his last support, his last hope. The conditions of detention in Lubyanka prison were unbearable. Hunger, cold, constant pressure, sleep deprivation, all this was part of a well-established system designed to break the prisoner's will. But even in these conditions, Meyerhold did not give up. He continued to deny his guilt, refusing to sign false protocols. However, the physical and psychological torture to which he was subjected eventually achieved its goal. On 2 February 1940, after many months of imprisonment, Vsevolod Meyerhold wrote his last letter. It was addressed to Vyacheslav Molotov, chairman of the Council of People's Commissars of the USSR, and a copy was probably intended for Joseph Stalin himself. This letter became one of the most terrifying and truthful documents of the era, revealing the true methods of the NKVD. In his letter, Meyerhold described in detail the torture he had been subjected to. He wrote, "They beat me, a sick old man, until I lost consciousness. They put me in a sack, poured water over me, and kept me in an ice-cold cell." He recounted sleepless nights when interrogations lasted without interruption, how he was deprived of rest, how he was threatened with reprisals against his loved ones. He described how, under pressure and torture, he was forced to sign a statement that did not correspond to reality, confessing to fictitious crimes of which he was accused. "I was forced to incriminate myself and others in order to end this torment," he wrote, revealing the mechanism of case fabrication with terrifying candor. He pleaded for a review of his case, for the opportunity to be heard and to receive a fair trial. This letter was not a plea for clemency in the usual sense. It was a cry for justice, a desperate attempt to convey the truth to those in power. He, a man who had fought for truth and art all his life, was now fighting for the truth about himself, for his good name. This letter was unprecedented in its candor and power. It did not simply deny guilt, it directly accused the system of torture and coercion to give false testimony. For the party elite of the USSR, for the government, for Joseph Stalin personally, this was more than just a prisoner's complaint. It was a direct refutation of the official version of the voluntary confessions of enemies of the people. Stalin was undoubtedly familiar with the contents of the letter. To forgive such a message would mean to acknowledge the imperfection or even criminality of the entire repressive machine he had built. It would have meant questioning the legitimacy of thousands of sentences handed down on the basis of such confessions. And that was absolutely impossible for a regime that built its legitimacy on a merciless struggle against enemies. Meyerhold's letter was a direct challenge to the system, and that challenge could not go unpunished. For a man who was accustomed to seeing every critic as a potential enemy, Meyerhold's words were not just a plea, but an act of defiance. They destroyed the carefully constructed myth of the infallibility of justice and the omnipotence of the state. In Stalin's eyes, Meyerhold had not only committed the crimes of which he was accused, but had also dared to cast a shadow on the methods of the NKVD, and thus on the leader himself. Such a thing could not be forgiven. Meyerhold's fate was sealed. The contrast between how Vsevolod Meyerhold imagined art as a path to truth and freedom, and how the system treated him as an unwelcome voice that had to be silenced, could not have been more striking. His work was about courage and innovation, his end about suppression and silence. Many might think that after such a letter, after such a desperate attempt to convey the truth, the system might falter, that there might be a chance for reconsideration, for mercy. That the voice of the great master, albeit imprisoned, would be heard in the highest offices, and his words would cause at least a shadow of doubt in the hearts of those who decided fates. However, in that ruthless era, when the state methodically eradicated all dissent, such a letter, filled with accusations of torture, could not be a path to salvation. On the contrary, it only strengthened the authorities' determination to destroy any trace of disobedience. After Vsevolod Meyerhold wrote his last letter, in which he revealed the methods of interrogation and torture with terrifying candor, his fate was, in essence, sealed. In the context of the Great Terror, when any hint of weakness or injustice was punished most severely, there could be only one response: complete and irrevocable destruction. Meyerhold's trial was swift and, like many others in those years, was a pure judicial farce. He was charged with the standard set of offenses for enemies of the people, counter-revolutionary activity, and participation in a counter-revolutionary organization. The charges were absurd for a man whose life was devoted to art, but logic was irrelevant at that time. The goal was not to establish the truth, but to extract a confession and deliver a sentence that would fit the party's predetermined line. The investigation, and later the trial, were held behind closed doors, without the participation of lawyers and without the possibility of presenting witnesses for the defense. This was common practice for the military collegium of the Supreme Court, a body that handed down thousands of death sentences during those years. The hearings lasted only a few minutes, sometimes no more than 15 or 20 minutes, and were merely a formal confirmation of the already fabricated charges. The interrogation reports, which Meyerhold was forced to sign under torture, became irrefutable evidence of his guilt. Thus, on 1 February 1940, just one day before his letter denouncing the torture was dated, Vsevolod Meyerhold was sentenced to the highest measure of social protection, execution by firing squad. This phrase, the highest measure of social protection, sounded like a mockery of justice, masking a death sentence for dissent, for talent, for rebelliousness of spirit. On that day, when he may still have hoped that his words would be heard, his fate was already sealed. He sat in a cold cell, perhaps pondering every sentence of his letter, while outside the walls his death sentence had already been signed. It was a time when even the most desperate attempt to appeal to the conscience of the authorities turned against the person, hastening their demise. The 2nd of February 1940 arrived. On that day, Vsevolod Meyerhold was shot. It was a striking, chilling speed. The sentence was handed down on the 1st of February, and the very next day it was carried out. Such haste left no chance for appeal, review, or the slightest delay. It was a demonstration of the ruthless efficiency of the repressive machine, which brooked no delay and gave no opportunity for a last word, for a last breath of hope. He, like thousands of other victims of the Great Terror, was taken to the Komunarka execution site, the former dacha of Heinrich Jagoda, which in those years became one of the main places of mass executions and burials in the Moscow region. This place, hidden from prying eyes, holds the stories of thousands of lives cut short. The body of Vsevolod Meyerhold, like the bodies of most of those shot at Komunarka, was buried in a mass grave, without a name, without a cross, without any identifying mark. This was part of a state policy aimed at completely erasing the memory of enemies of the people. There was to be no grave where loved ones could come, no name that could be spoken aloud. The goal was not only physical destruction, but also the destruction of historical memory, an oblivion that was to be eternal. Immediately after Meyerhold's arrest and death, his name began to be systematically erased from the history of Soviet art. His plays were banned, his name was removed from encyclopedias, textbooks, and all official documents. Any mention of him became taboo. The works of his students and followers were also persecuted. This had enormous consequences for the entire cultural sphere. Seeing Meyerhold's fate, many theater figures were forced to resort to self-censorship, abandoning bold experiments and innovative ideas. Fear became a powerful tool of control. The theater, which under Meyerhold had been lively, searching, rebellious, was forced to go underground or adapt to the demands of socialist realism, losing its sharpness and depth. During this period, many unique developments, methods, and ideas that could have enriched world theater were lost. Instead of diversity of form and boldness of thought, uniformity and predictability reigned supreme. This continued for many years. The name of Vsevolod Meyerhold remained in the shadows, half forgotten, half forbidden. Only a few dared to preserve his memory, passing it on in whispers from mouth to mouth. Official rehabilitation came much later, after Stalin's death, during the so-called thaw in 1955. Only then was his name cleared of trumped-up charges, and the slow, difficult return of the great director to the history of Soviet and world art began. But those years of oblivion, fear, and destruction left a deep, unhealed scar.